Sex workers and their clients are responsible for 6% of all new HIV infection rates in South Africa. Research shows that criminalising sex work does almost nothing to stop it, and making it illegal makes it more dangerous. Now, this includes pushing up HIV infection rates. So while HIV is controlled, sort of, in the general population due to our progressive LV program, key populations like sex workers are struggling. Have morals trumped research in the fight against the virus in the world's oldest profession? Mail and Guardian health editor and founder of Bekisisa Miyabalan is with us tonight. Joining us on Skype, the Deputy Director General for HIV at the National Department of Health, Jürgen Pillay, and Sweat human rights advocate Nosipho Vidima joins us from Cape Town. A very warm welcome. Milan, let me start off with you. Tell me about these key population groups. Why is the focus moved there?
So as you've mentioned, Jane, that we have increased access to antiretroviral treatment dramatically in South Africa particularly, and also around the world. So the HIV response has now moved to particularly focusing on certain groups of populations that have higher HIV infection rates. And in South Africa, those groups would be sex workers, young women are very vulnerable, men who have sex with men, and also people who use drugs. So in the case of sex workers, a survey has shown that in Johannesburg, our HIV infection rates are extremely high. In Johannesburg, 72% of sex workers, female sex workers, are infected with HIV.
Wow, that's a staggering number.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we face is that when sex work is criminalized, health services become less accessible because there's discrimination, and there's also more violence because if you practice an illegal profession, then you can't go and report violent clients. And there's a very, very strong link between HIV infection and violence for two reasons, many, but two main reasons. The one is that if you have the threat of violence, you're in a position where you can't negotiate for condom use to prevent infection, and also that there's trauma. So there would be vaginal lacerations where HIV can enter your blood much easier. And the issue with treatment is not just to keep people alive. As the previous guest has mentioned, that if you use ARVs correctly, part of those 1990 goals that you mentioned is that you can become virally suppressed. And what that means is that it becomes scientifically impossible for you to transmit the virus to others. So treatment is also a prevention method, which means that if you get sex workers, only less than a quarter of sex workers in Johannesburg take up ARVs. In other words, HIV can spread much easier.
And why do so few take it up? Is it because they don't have the access, or is there fear element?
No, the government actually provides free ARVs, and we've got the largest program in the world. But research shows us that when you practice an illegal profession, as soon as an activity becomes illegal,
that's what I'm saying, yes,
people stop using a service. So if you compare female sex workers' uptake of ARVs, as I said, less than a quarter, with the uptake of ARVs of the general female population in South Africa, that uptake is more than 70%. So it is much lower than the general female population, and it's both females, but there are certain barriers that prevent sex workers from accessing the treatment.
Nosipho Vidima, what do you make of this focus now to target these groups? It sounds, according to Mia, the right way to go.
Our take as the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force has been that the main barrier to sex workers actually accessing any of the services that you have being rolled out by government is of course our legislative framework, which is criminalization right now. It makes sex workers to move in isolation from facilities that could render them these services. So a sex worker will go to a clinic once and explain their situation. Maybe I had a condom that burst, but the second time they go, the nurses will actually start questioning how many partners that they have, and the third time, obviously, it will start being clear that the sex worker might be doing sex work and they have to out themselves. And because of criminalization, it means that a sex worker has outed themselves not only where she could face moral judgment, but she also faces the chance of actually being named a criminal. That means that a sex worker is not going to go back the 4th time. She's going to use backdoor services. Backdoor services most of the time do not actually give sex workers the much needed medication to deal. Yes, it's pretty dangerous for one reason. If you go to backdoor and you're looking for, let's say, an STI treatment, you're not necessarily going to get the right kind of medication for the STI that you have, because with over-the-counter most of the time, what they provide are very, very basic, which do not actually treat all the STIs that we have, which means you have an untreated sex worker who's still going to face sexual violence from those who actually pretend to be sex worker service users who come as clients, for instance, who then might also rape a sex worker, which means you keep on having.
It just keeps going on and on and on. I find these numbers quite staggering. That something like, in this research, 1 in 3 out of 57 women were raped by police, and the sort of horrific things that the police made them do, which feeds into your story of the fear and how these women are being treated, and why they might never go for the sort of treatment that they need.
So, for instance, I myself have actually been raped by a police officer in my time. And it's very hard to actually step into a police station and report a police officer that has raped you. It's even going to be harder when you're actually going to report this rape at a hospital or a clinic, because they're going to want you to come with the police report before you can get treatment, whether it's post-exposure paralysis, which we call PEP, or any kind of morning after pill at a hospital. You will actually have to explain what happened on top of the rape that you need to be actually taken care for.
And Mia, obviously, if the sex worker has been infected, has got HIV, AIDS, then it would just proliferate at an extraordinary rate, wouldn't it, if you're seeing multiple clients in a day? Possibly.
Absolutely, and research shows us that the reason why you would want to treat sexually transmitted infections within the broader framework of HIV prevention is because a sexually transmitted infection makes it easier to contract HIV. And it puts people like Nosipho in a very difficult position. And tomorrow we will feature a deep analysis in Mala Guardian of this type of story, and Nosipho's story is in there. And the interesting thing that we can learn from other models is we travel to Amsterdam to look at where sex work
contrast, isn't
yes,
it?
where it's legal, and if you look at sexually transmitted infections such as gonorrhea there, in Amsterdam, the infection rate of gonorrhea and 2 other sexually transmitted infections is half that of the general female population, because there are sex worker clinics where there's no fear of going there, you're not doing something illegal, you can access services freely. Now, their model is the model of legalizing sex work. It's different from decriminalising, which you will get in New Zealand and parts of Australia, but there are lots of similarities. And for instance,
I should imagine in every case that all the rates are quite a lot lower, and violence is largely taken out of the scenario.
Yes, so the HIV infection rate among sex workers in Amsterdam specifically is 0.5%, which is a very low rate for sex workers. There's a brothel that I visited where in most brothels, by law, you need a panic button in the brothel if a client becomes abusive. And when you press that button, the police will be there within 5 minutes to come and help you. Or mostly it's actually the sex workers that help each other, because there's no fear of helping another person because it's a legal profession. So that makes an immense difference in how you can protect yourself. Also, that you have, because you're not doing something illegal, you have more time to decide whether you want to take a client or not. If you don't have that time, it happens that you take the wrong person. Maybe it's an intoxicated person or just a very violent person. It helps if you can negotiate, also negotiate for condom use then. And in the brothel where I were, there were house rules up against the wall. And number 3 of the house rules were you are not allowed to request sex without a condom. If you could do that openly and make it that obvious that you can't practice unsafe sex, it obviously happens much easier.
It just seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? We're going to bring in Deputy Director General for HIV at the National Department of Health, Jürgen Pillay. Good to have you with us. I'm interested to hear what you think about targeting these certain groups, how effective it would be here in South Africa? And is there any appetite where you are for this to happen?
Jane, thanks very much, and good evening to your listeners and viewers. We've been focusing on female sex workers in particular, as well as men who have sex with men, as well as young people more recently. So in June 2016, through a number of clinics that are dedicated to providing a comprehensive package of service to female sex workers in particular, we've been offering services that relate to both treatment, testing, treatment, and for those that are negative, we've also offered them pre-exposure prophylaxis. So this has been happening since 2016, and in the intervening period between 2016 and to date, we have tested over 65,000 sex workers, mostly females, of whom 57,000 were negative, and about 12% therefore were positive. They were offered PrEP, and about almost 6,000 accepted PrEP amongst those that tested negative. Those that test positive, of course, are offered treatment, and they are also screened for sexually transmitted infections and provided with condoms. So it's a comprehensive service that's provided in these almost standalone.
And how hard was it to get people to accept the help and the treatment that's there?
Well, because these are standalone clinics, these are clinics that are not integrated into the mainstream clinics. They are standalone clinics, so they really have been able to mobilize community through community health workers, mobilize sex workers to receive these services, and they seem to be very happy with these services. Now, of course, one of the challenges is to ensure that every clinic in the country, of which we have almost 4,000, provides a similar service, and that's where there are challenges, Jane.
I mean, do you think you'd be able to roll this out even further, considering in 2017 Cyril Ramaphosa launching the fourth HIV plan excluded arguments advocating decriminalisation? I mean, if that's already off the table, where do you start?
Well, it's not off the table. The South African Law Reform Commission was tasked by Cabinet to look at this issue because, as you can imagine, it's not only a health issue, it's also a social issue, and for some people it's a moral issue. Even though from the Department of Health perspective, it is obviously a public health issue, and we deal with it as a public health issue. They have made certain recommendations, and Cabinet has requested that the Department of Justice begin consultation, broad-based consultation, around whether we legalize sex work, decriminalize it, or have some kind of approach to it. Certainly from the Department of Health, we treat everybody, regardless of sexual orientation or how they earn their income, because, for us, sex work is work, as our former Deputy President and now President said when he launched the National Sex Worker Program.
Okay, Nosipho, I mean, when you hear about the challenges, I mean, there are few solutions there for those who are able to access those clinics. Why are so many women driven into this? Obviously, money is a factor. I do understand that. But are many of them pressurized to take this sort of work? Are there alternatives for them?
So I want to stay away from us looking at this in a position where we're saying that women are forced into this work. A few sex workers will tell you straight that they choose this work instead of domestic work because domestic work does not actually give them the financial freedom that they would want. And as a country that stands on freedom of choice, we should allow women to actually make this as a decision and make this as a choice for themselves. We cannot stand on moral ground and police women's bodies to such an extent that we're actually putting them in vulnerability. If we're going to put this moral ground and say that you are protecting sex workers from themselves. You are basically saying that the sex workers do not have a choice to their bodies. They do not have a choice to economical freedom and economical participation in the country. They do not have a choice to actually raise their children as they would want to raise them with the money that they earn from sex work. But more, it's about protecting the human dignity that sex workers hold. Everybody has dignity to do as they please, as long as it's harmless to anybody. And sex work is not a harmful practice to anybody. And should sex workers be protected and put under labor laws, then we actually reducing any kind of exploitation or violations that sex workers have to face in South Africa. I mean, with decriminalization, while we're talking about just HIV, a Lancet report that was done shows us that 46% reduction actually happens where decriminalization is the legislative model in a country. I guess that is what we would want. It has also shown that 45% safer working environment are seen, which means that, like Mia has said, when a client enters an establishment of buying sex work, they would be obligated or held accountable to using a condom. Also, it means that sex workers can form cooperatives and actually own brothels themselves. They wouldn't be owned by what you would call pimps, but instead, women would be empowered enough to say that we're going to own this and we're going to run it in a way that we want.
They can get back control, aren't they? I mean, Mia, it's not something that's ever going to go away, is it? I mean, you will never, ever get rid of it. So South Africa obviously needs to tackle it. And if you empower these women and make them healthy, obviously that'll have a dramatic knock-on effect on their children, their families, socio-economic climes.
Absolutely. It's the oldest profession in the world. It's not going to go away. It's always been there. If we look at research in New Zealand, where sex work has been decriminalised, the number of sex workers did not increase. That's what people often fear. Will the number of sex workers double? Yeah. You know, it does not happen. Research shows us it isn't happening. And I think decriminalisation is not just seen as an advocacy argument. It's an endorsed solution. The World Health Organization has called for decriminalisation of sex work. UNAIDS has called for it. And South Africa COSATU has called for it. And it's interesting when Dr. Pillay said sex work is work, the Justice Department does not view it that way. That commission report that he spoke about that came out was very explicit in saying they do not regard sex work as decent work or a reasonable means to get an income from. And they recommended the continued criminalisation of sex work as the first option, and then another option of partial decriminalisation that also doesn't work that well. So for us in South Africa, it's very important to continue to follow the evidence instead of prejudice.
And make them more active in the economy. Just think how much they could put back. But it's a big conversation tackling these target groups. Sex work is one of them. Mia Maran, Jorgen Pillay and Nosipho Vidima, thank you very much. And still ahead, where we're likely to be had it not been for AIDS denialism of the early 2000s.